And while we're talking about roster construction out of the draft as well, I wanted to ask your opinion on taking goaltenders high in the draft, because that was something that Harper did this year in the first round. He took Andrei Vasilevsky 7th overall, and that was something that raised some eyebrows. So what are your thoughts on taking goalies high, Ken?
Can't do it. You can't take a goalie in the first 2 rounds. And I that was the first video on my channel. I actually got this tip from it was NHL Radio on The Point with Boomer Gordon, and I was listening to him. He has a fantasy show on Fridays at 2. It's a really great resource, and he was basically just kind of harping on that tone of like, just don't pick a goalie in the first round. And I'm like, why? So I looked into it, and basically in the last 5 years of my league, everybody who's picked a goalie high has finished in the bottom 6 out of 12, or bottom half out of 10 or whatever. And it just basically comes down to, there's guys especially as the scoring increases and there's more and more players that are over 100-point pace or well over a point per game pace. Those guys at the top of the draft who put up a ton of points, they're very consistent. They typically, like Huberdeau this year is one of the only examples of a guy who's a very high pick who's just like he doesn't have it this year. Typically, everybody who's picked in the top 2 rounds that's a forward or a defenseman will have at least some level of a good season. And then, most of the time, if you're picking McDavid, Draisaitl, you're getting excellent performance. But with goaltending, typically every year there's a goalie that comes out of nowhere and ends up, in the Vezina conversation. This year it's Ullmark. Vanecek's one of those guys that I never saw coming, and he's just taken off. And you can usually find those guys on the wire. You can find them deep in drafts. Obviously, Ullmark, probably not a wire guy, but Vanecek had hit the wire in some leagues. So you can usually find a starting goalie that becomes elite deeper in the draft, but you will never find a 1.5 point per game offensive player that deep in the draft. So that's why if the guy in my league had Shesterkin 7th, and he started out really well. He was in the first place for a couple weeks, and now he's in 7th, and he's falling back out of the playoffs because he just doesn't have the offense to power him forward, especially in a category league where you have 6 offensive categories and then 4 goaltending categories. So it's a little bit different if you're in a points league and you get, special weighting for wins, shutouts, and that kind of thing, total saves. That might change the equation a little bit, but in general, you're not going to get access to those elite, like 1.5 point per game guys anywhere else in the draft, and you can get goaltenders later in the draft.
Yeah, so missing out on the top tier production players by taking a goalie high, and just the fact that goalies are wildly inconsistent, save for a few in the NHL. I would say Shesterkin, Vasilevsky.
Those guys have been good. They're just not the number one guy in fantasy. And it's very difficult for that guy to be picked at the top and then stay there the entire year and not dip at all. Like that's part of the whole thought process too.
Right, and games played too is another factor, because even if you're Andrei Vasilevsky or Igor Shesterkin, you're not going to play all 82 games, whereas Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid, if they're healthy, they are going to play those games. So Harper, all of that being said, do you have any pushback? Any you want to defend your pick or what?
Well, it's hilarious that immediately as that got brought up, I knew that was directed at me. You're just shaking your head right off the bat with that. But, I was kind of kicking myself after, because realizing that fantasy hockey at the end of the day, a lot of it is about points and having those top point producers on your team.